Let's work on the icons. Primarily we use icons inside buttons, but so far we haven't yet introduced TypeScript into icons module. First of all, let's take a look at one of the examples how we use icons. There is an example of it inside timeline stopwatch component. As we can see, when we're using base icon component, we have to pass prop called name, where we specify an icon we'd like to display. And then inside base icon component, we are using dynamic view component, and based on the passed icon name as a prop, we are extracting icon view component from an icons object that we have imported from an icons module. As you can see inside this icons module, we are importing a bunch of icon components, then create constants to represent every icon's name, and eventually we are creating an object where keys would be icon names and values would be corresponding view components that represent those icons. But what if we are actually going to create a separate enumeration that is going to represent valid icons, instead of storing icon names as a separate constants in here? So let's just write out, I'm going to export new type called icon name inside types.ts, and then based on this set of constants, I'm going to use them as an individual elements of this enumeration. Let's just convert this syntax into valid enumeration type, like so. We also need a comma at the end of each enumeration entry. And now we can use this new icon name type to represent icon names. For example, when we were declaring nowItemInterface, we were using type string for an icon property, but now that we have a custom type that represents icons, instead of this string we can use our type icon name, which means that this property icon will only be able to store valid icon names, but not any random string. And now back to icons module, and let's consider one more time this icons object. If I'm going to add any property inside this object, we're not gonna get any TypeScript error, but it would be actually good if TypeScript would inform us that we have used invalid icon name inside this object. So in order to make TypeScript inform us about such cases, we're going to type this constant by using the record type, which is a generic type, which additionally accepts two dynamic arguments. The first argument represents the type of the key of an object. In our case, we're only allowed to use valid icon names, so I'm gonna specify our custom icon name type in here. And as a second argument, which represents type of values inside this object, we're going to use view component type. And now let's import both of these types. And right away we can see that invalid property name is highlighted, so TypeScript now informs us about any invalid properties in this object. And there is even more. If we'll by accident miss any of the icons in this object, we're also going to get an error because it's necessary to provide all the icon names inside this object that are actually listed inside icon name enumeration. Now let's just specify keyword type inside import statement for the component type right here. And at this point we can actually get rid of all these individual constant declaration that represent icon names, because we are using enumeration where all icon names are grouped. So instead of using constants as keys for this object, we're going to use enumeration icon name and reference individual elements of this enumeration. The end result will be the same, but now we actually use more appropriate type where all valid icon names are grouped. So the next thing we need to do is actually replace all icon name constants that are used inside view components to use enumeration icon name. For example, inside activity item component, instead of using icon trash constant, we're going to reference icon name enumeration and use specific icon name in here, but without using icon prefix. And then let's not forget and remove unused constant icon trash, rearrange these import statements a little bit, and move on to the next component. We haven't yet introduced TypeScript inside base icon component, so let's do it just yet right now. I'm going to add length attribute with a value at ts, and let's properly type props of this component. So this component accepts one property called name, which will be valid icon name. So in our case, we can use our custom type icon name right here that we have created earlier. And as for the validation function isIconValid, we no longer need to use this function, so I'm gonna go inside validators.ts and get rid of this function from here. And also let's remove this unused import. Let's get back to base icon component and remove all commented code. Let's also add type keyword inside this import and move on to the next component, base select. Inside of this component, we're using one icon with a name iconXMark. So I'm going to convert this usage to use our newly created type icon name and reference icon with a name mark. And then let's scroll up and remove this unused import of the constant and move on to the next component. The next one will be the activity form. In here, we also have one icon that we need to convert to use icon name enumeration. And then also let's remove this unused import of constant. The next component will be the header progress component. In here, let's search for an icon, check circle, use our new enumeration icon name, reference an icon with a name check circle, and remove unused import of the old constant. Identical steps we're going to do inside the next component, which is the logo component. I'm going to use icon name enumeration and reference icon with a name clock, and then I'll scroll up and remove unused import of this constant. We're doing pretty much same steps with all view components, where we're using icons. And finally, we are left with only one component where we still have to use icon name enumeration instead of icon name constants, which is timeline stopwatch component. So I'm going to do this conversion in here 3 times by using icon name enumeration and referencing corresponding icon names. And finally, we can scroll up and remove this import of 3 unused constants. Now that we have done converting all view components, there is also one more file where we are using icon names. This file is called constants.ts. So in here, I'm going to use icon name enumeration to reference corresponding icons instead of using icon name constants in all of these places. And right after that, we can remove the import of unused constants. And this way, by introducing new type which represents valid icon names, we were able to improve our code just a little bit. So now let's open up the browser and click around a little bit in our application to make sure that after all our recent changes, we haven't actually broken our application. As we can see, so far so good. Application works as expected. So let's continue development in the next lesson.